everyone, thanks for tuning in. I'm Lauren and this video is part of my Top Sewing Tips blog series where I want to show you all of the important components and skills that you need to know if you want to make your own clothes at home. And this video is all about hand sewing. And hand sewing is a really useful basic skill to know and to be confident in doing when you're sewing your own clothes. Even if you're sewing them on a sewing machine, there's still going to be instances that you come across where you do have to hand sew. So in this video I'm going to cover some of the tools and things that you might need or you might find useful when you come to do hand sewing. I'm going to cover how to start and end your hand sewing, which is really important to make sure that your hand sewing lasts and doesn't just fall apart. And then I'm also going to cover 3 of the most common stitches that you might come across when you're hand sewing and dressmaking. So that is a running or a tacking or basting stitch. That's the first one. The next one is a whip stitch or an overcast stitch, and then the last one is what I call a ladder stitch, but it does sometimes get called an invisible stitch or a blind stitch as well. So first of all, I want to cover tools and things that you might need when you do come to hand sew. So obviously you need a needle, and there's loads of different hand sewing needles that you can get. Try not to be confused or overwhelmed about them. If you stick with a sharps needle, that's what the type it's called, sharps, they are good for just general all-purpose sewing. So if you're not sure what hand sewing needle to get, just get a sharps. It's going to do for most things. You're obviously going to need some thread, and you just want to use the same thread that's in your sewing machine. My personal preference of thread brand is Gutermann, but also there's lots of different brands out there that you can get. So if you were making a garment and you needed some thread, just pull the thread out of your sewing machine and use that. The next thing that you might need is a thimble. Now, I personally don't use a thimble. That's just kind of the way that I have got used to hand sewing. I feel like I don't need one. I feel like it gets in my way when I come to hand sew. But of course, there are other people who just swear by a thimble and they can't hand sew without a thimble. So it's really a personal preference thing. There are lots of different types you can get. There's like the kind of traditional metal one. You can get these really nice soft ergonomic ones that have got a kind of rubbery grip. You can get ones that are made of leather, and there's all sorts of different thimbles, and you just kind of have to find one that you like that's sort of your preference, but you don't have to use one. And then the other thing that you might come across, you might find useful sometimes, is beeswax. So this is just a block of wax. It comes in this little sort of plastic casing, and to use that, before you hand sew, when you've got your length of thread through your needle, you just pass the thread through the beeswax and it just coats it very, very lightly with the wax, and it makes the thread a little bit more slippy, so the thread is then less likely to get knotted or tangled. And it does sort of strengthen the thread a little bit as well. So you don't have to use it, but you can do if you want to. I also keep my hand sewing needles in one of these really handy needle twisters. They're so cool. They work a bit like a lipstick. So you just pull the lid off and then twist the bottom, and the needles kind of fan out. So there's a magnet in the bottom of that the needles stick to, so it makes it easy to sort of pick it up. And then it just means they don't sort of disappear or get lost in your pin cushion if you've got one of them. So I keep my hand sewing needles in there. So first of all, I want to cover actually starting and ending your hand stitching. But before I do that, I want to cover how long the length of thread is that's on your needle. So I would recommend using a length of thread that can be doubled up. So when I do hand sewing, I like to sew so that there's 2 equal lengths of thread coming down from the eye of the needle. I just feel like it's a bit stronger, it's less likely to come unthreaded as you're sewing it, and I just personally prefer that. There will be some instances where I will just use a single thread if I'm like doing very fine work, or like I really don't want the thread to be seen or want it to be very minimal, but generally 2 lengths is good. And in terms of how long they actually are, using the length of your forearm is quite a good guide. And the reason I say that is because if you have a really long thread, then every stitch you make, you've got to pull through all of this thread. It's more likely to get tangled. It takes longer to do each stitch. It's better to have a bit of a shorter length of thread and then just tie it off and start a new one if you're doing a lot of hand sewing and you need more thread. So I think that's quite important, because I think you can get tangled and all knotted up quite easily when you hand sew if your thread's too long. So then in terms of starting, there's a couple of options. You can either tie a knot at the end of the thread, so you just loop the thread around your finger and then put the tail of the thread through that loop and pull it. That will give you quite a small knot, and depending on what fabric you're using, sometimes even when you put that knot through the fabric and pull on the thread, you still just pull the knot through the fabric. It's not strong enough. So it might be that you have to tie a couple of those knots and try to get the knots on top of each other so that it just makes a bigger knot and then it can't pull through the thread. So that's one option. My personal preference is that I don't tie a knot at the bottom of the thread, and instead what I'll do is take a tiny little stitch, kind of like on the spot wherever I'm going to be starting my hand sewing, and I'll pull the thread through, but just leave a little bit sticking out, and then I'll do another couple of stitches, so like 3 stitches in total, just on the same spot, just like over and over in that same little spot. And then you can see that when I pull and tug on the thread, that thread is really secure into that fabric. So getting a strong starting point is important. And then equally, when you then do come to finish your hand sewing as well, you want to make sure that you're kind of knotting it off or securing it in the same way. So of course you could just finish sewing, and then if you've got two lengths of thread, you could like tie a knot. I don't really feel like that's strong enough often. So what I do is I'll do just like a tiny little stitch on the spot. So I'm just kind of catching a few threads of the fabric, and then I'll go to pull the thread through, and before I pull it all the way through, it leaves this like loop of thread here, I just put the needle through that loop and then pull on it, and that creates a knot. And I'll usually do that 2, maybe 3 times, just doing a little stitch in the spot, passing the needle through the loop of thread before I pull it all through, and just tying it off that way. So that's the starting and ending. It's good to make sure that you do that securely, because otherwise your hand stitching is definitely just gonna fall out. So now on to the actual stitches that you might come across. The first one's really easy. It's just a running or a basting or a tacking stitch. The words basting and tacking basically mean kind of temporarily holding fabric together before you sew it. So say you were sewing something with quite slippery fabric that was moving around all over the place, you may want to hand tack that or hand baste it into position before you sew it on the sewing machine. So tacking or basting is usually just a step towards actually finally sewing it on the machine. And the stitches are quite loose, they're quite long, and you're really simply just kind of going in and out the fabric. It's like, if you've ever been taught to hand sew as a child, you've probably been shown this stitch. It's just really easy going in and out through the fabric. The stitches are generally of equal length. You don't have to pull on them too hard. Depending on how strong you want the basting to be, you could use a single length of thread or a double. Probably wouldn't really matter too much. It's up to you. But that is a tacking or a basting stitch. It might also be that you're not sort of tying it off or securing it as tightly as you would with the other stitches that I'm going to show you, because the stitching's not permanent. It's a means to an end, because you're tacking or basting something before you actually sew it on the machine. So it might be that you're basting or tacking a zip-in or a sleeve head or some binding, that kind of thing. They're sort of places that you might want to use it. So the next stitch that I want to show you is an overcast or a whip stitch, and this is useful in places where you're maybe not necessarily going to see the stitches as much. So it might be something like a top or a dress with a facing, and you want to hold the facing to the shoulder seam on the inside, and you just do like a little stitch round and round to hold that in place there. So once you have secured your thread and knotted it and it's nice and snug in the fabric, you tug on it, it doesn't come out, then you just get the 2 bits of fabric that you're going to be sewing together and literally just stitch through both of them, and then go over the top and then just do a stitch again, and you're just kind of going round and round and round. So that's sort of where the whip stitch comes from. And the overcast is that you can see it sort of overcasting the 2 edges of fabric, or the 2 folds as you sort of bring them together, and you can see that that stitching is, it is visible. You can actually see it, and then of course you secure it off and tie it again. The last stitch I want to show you is what I call the ladder stitch, but it does get called blind stitch or invisible stitch as well. and it means that you don't actually see the stitching. So this is really good in places where the stitching might then be visible on the outside of your garment, but you want to hide it and you want to conceal it. This is my favourite type of stitching. So it's good if you are bringing like a folds of fabric together, or if you're, say you were putting a lining in a garment that had a zip at the back, and it might be that you want to invisibly stitch the lining to the zip on the inside of the garment, an example. Or it might be on the binding and neckline, you've machined the binding on, but then you want to hand sew it down invisibly and just make it look really sleek and professional. So there's lots of different places that you might want to use this. So again, you got to secure your thread, make sure it's nice and tight and snug in the fabric. And then you're either bringing the two folds of fabric together, or it might be like a folded bit of fabric up against another flat bit of fabric, or like a zip tape in that example. And what you're doing is taking a little stitch within the fold of the fabric, and then where the thread leaves that fold is where you put the stitch in on the other fold or the flat bit of fabric. And then you take a stitch of equal length, and then where the thread leaves that, you then put it back in the fold. So when you travel across from one fold to the other, or the flat bit of fabric to the fold, that's sort of creating the rung of the ladder. And then when you actually take the stitch up the side, and that is what's creating like the side of the ladder. So that's where the name ladder stitch comes from. Obviously blind or invisible is because when you draw it up and you pull it nice and snug, you totally don't see the stitches, and it just comes together really invisibly. So depending on what you're actually sewing together here, it depends on the length of the stitches. You want them to be fairly small, like I'm talking less than 0.5 centimetre, but it might be that they could even be smaller than that. I've also used it to just sew down the little corner bit of the lining on one of my coats, because sometimes when you bag lining out in a coat, you don't machine it all the way around. There's like a little bit that you sort of finish off. I've used it on the side of Roman blinds when I've made them. I'm trying to think of other examples when I've used it. I do actually use that one quite a lot. So yeah, I would say that's a good one to sort of master and know as well, because it is invisible, so it'll give a really nice professional finish to your garments. So I hope that's inspired you to give it a try. I know a lot of people just sort of gasp when they hear hand sewn and they're like, oh, I don't want to do it. But I actually don't mind it. As a teenager and a child, I used to do a lot of cross stitch kits. I did cross stitch for years, done so many of them, and I guess that probably honed my hand sewing skills, which is why I've got the patience for it. But I know that some people don't like it as much, but it is worth knowing and practicing, because it can give your handmade garments a really nice touch. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I hope you found that useful. Just remember to hit subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss out on my next one. If you've got any questions or comments or anything, just leave them for me below, and I'll see you next time. Thanks, and bye.